We're really lucky to have to wrap up this discussion the person who is at the middle of all these disputes about high-speed rail and other parts of transit. That is, of course, Dan Richard, who you know as chair of the High-Speed Rail Authority. Before that, for 12 years, he was an elected board member of BART, twice its president. He takes responsibility, good and bad, for bringing BART to San Francisco Airport. I think good. He's had his background in energy. He's worked for Governor Brown in all of Governor Brown's various incarnations. I think that is true.
Except as mayor of
that's
Oakland,
true. Yes.
Right?
Well, when he goes back and runs for mayor again, you can join him once more.
Yeah.
Or in his presidential campaign.
Yeah.
Anything is possible. There are two transit area notes, transit subject notes for Dan's appearance here. One is he agreed to come here even though he has to be in New York tomorrow morning, is taking the red eye, which is a price I almost, well, that is a real price to pay. And the other transportation note is the way I know Dan originally has nothing at all to do with high-speed rail. It has to do, we both fly the same kind of small airplane, the Cirrus SR-22. And indeed, when I first started asking you about high-speed rail a year ago, you flew down to Merced, and you have a plane there, and talked about the intermodal miracle that is high-speed rail and small airplanes and all the rest. A year ago, when I talked to Dan and Mike McCoy about this large infrastructure bet that was being made in California, I was agnostic about the project as a whole. I'd lived in China for a long time, in Japan for a long time, been to Europe, and had seen the way that high-speed rail transformed those countries and made things different than it could possibly have been, but I didn't know whether this project, so controversial in California, really made sense in our environment, our economic environment, our political environment, and all the rest. In that year, I've published roughly 20 zillion words on the Atlantic's website on the case for high-speed rail, pro and con. And what's been really interesting is that over that time, I've become convinced that this is certainly a worthwhile bet for the country, for the state, for this generation in our history. The other thing that has impressed me is the way that Dan Richard, several times, when I'd receive some bushel shipment of angry email from people, Dan would go through one after another and address the complaints. So I thought that what I would do for the next few minutes here is present myself as part of the reading public. And since I have said I've been convinced by your arguments, but I know it's very controversial, I'm going to present to you some of the hardest criticisms, or at least once I've heard of high-speed rail, and hear what the perspective is, why you nonetheless think it's worthwhile going ahead with this project. So that's what we'll do for the next while, and then when I'm done with that, if I've left out some of the criticisms, we'll have time for questions from all of you, and then Dan will be glad to get on the red eye after all of that. So I think that the main, well, is there any introductory comment you would like to make?
Actually, just one. You know, our little airplanes go pretty fast. We go about 200 miles an hour. I had a chance to fly the governor at one point. I pointed out to him that if we had a 10-knot headwind, we'd be looking down on the high-speed rail train pulling away from us on the ground. So it kind of puts it in perspective. It's an exciting program, and I guess I would just start by saying that the theme of this is bold bets. To have bold bets, you need bold leaders to make those, and we're very fortunate in California that Jerry Brown is that leader, because he had every opportunity to walk away from this project. It was not started under his administration. Right. And yet he came in and looked at it and said, this is important for the future of California, for a lot of the reasons that we've been hearing: population growth, environmental protection, and so forth. And
actually, let's start there with the criticisms and vulnerabilities of the plan. We know that Governor Brown ran for re-election and won very easily. We know that he has embraced high-speed rail as one of his signature projects for the state. We also know he's in his fourth and last term as governor. Mm-hmm. So how much can he do in the next 4 years to ensure that so controversial a program actually goes ahead? Because somebody will come after him. It may be somebody who runs against it. It may be somebody who says this has just become too costly. How will you make a difference in 4 years that can last beyond that time?
Well, first of all, he was there at the critical time when the California legislature had to decide whether or not to appropriate the money and go forward with the project. And he led the effort, along with legislative leaders, to make that happen. So we got over a huge hump there. And then 2 years later, he led the effort to give us a permanent funding source with these cap-and-trade dollars in California, where we get 25% on an ongoing basis of this, which actually, ironically, gives us one of the more stable funding sources of any transportation program in the United States. So he has already laid the groundwork for the project. Now we have to build it. And I think that 4 years from now, what you will see is that we will be substantially through construction in the Central Valley of the 130-mile spine of the system. And we will also have taken steps at the ends of the system. You've heard a lot today about the electrification of the Caltrain alignment. We're going to use that alignment. And so I just think that 4 years from now, we're going to have a lot of momentum. And it's also possible that people will start to see test trains or other things, maybe not in 4 years, but soon thereafter. And that's going to change the dynamic even further. So I don't want to say anything's inevitable, but I do believe that we've got a lot of momentum now and that that's going to carry through.
Right. You mentioned that you have this quasi-stable funding source in the cap and trade money and from the bond and all the rest. I've come across almost no one who actually believes the budget estimates are plausible and that you'll find the money to realize them. What is your response to people who say this is going to cost way more than you say and there's not going to be enough money anyway?
Well, large infrastructure projects sometimes, in fact, quite often go over budget, and people look at the Big Dig or they look at other projects like that and they point to that and say there's no way that this is going to cost what you guys say it's going to cost. But the good news is that so far, actually, it's costing less because the initial bids that we got in for the first construction segments have all come in substantially below our engineers' estimates. Second thing is that when you start a project like this, people draw lines on a map. And as you get down to brass tacks and look at what it really takes to go past this farm or this dairy or this business or this residential area, a lot of costs start to come into programs. Countering that, though, we're now at the stage where we've moved beyond planning and we're bringing in the engineers who are really looking at what we call value engineering. And they're finding ways to tighten budgets, to shrink budgets, and so forth. I want to give a shout out to our CEO, Jeff Morales, who's here. Jeff had run Chicago Transit. He'd run California's Transportation Department, Caltrans. And Jeff is really putting a lot of pressure on the organization to find better, cheaper, faster ways to get this delivered. And we're finding those. So I do believe that, plus the technique we use, which is called design build, which transfers some of the design risk to the bidder. If you're redoing your kitchen, the first thing that the construction guy says is that the architect was nuts and this can't be built that way, and so it's going to, here's the first change order 5 minutes into the job. What the design build approach does is it really limits that opportunity for change orders because the constructor is also finishing the design. So we're very cognizant of the need not just to build this, but to not screw it up, because I think that all eyes are on California at this point. And if we're successful with this project, I truly believe, and I think our leadership team believes, it's going to spawn similar initiatives across the country. If we give this a big black eye, then that's going to give people pause. So we're quite focused on it.
Have you gotten to the bottom of one under budget but suspicious bid that came in that I actually wrote a little item about?
The 1, 2, 3, 4,
yes.
5, yes. Well, I mean, some of that I think was whimsy, but actually we have gotten to the bottom of it, and I can talk about it now. I couldn't before, but...
Explain what it was.
Yeah, well, first of all, what happened was that the winning bidder, which was a consortium led by the Spanish company Dragados, along with its partners Flatiron and Shimmick, actually came in substantially below the next bid and substantially below our engineers' estimates. Their particular bid was $1.23456 billion,
and 789, I think they carried it out.
I think they did, and but that was really that was either whimsical or it was whatever they do. But the real point of this was that they were hundreds of millions of dollars below the engineers' estimates because they came up with a much more innovative way to develop the alignment through these areas, where they substituted, instead of retaining walls, they used cut and slope landscaping and grading. And it was a great example of getting a competitive process in place, having 5 internationally recognized companies pre-qualified, 3 of them bid in this particular instance, and that competition drove down the price. as long as we can be the organization that is transparent to these companies, because they have to put a lot of money into these bids, they all want to be a part of this, and we will benefit from that competition going forward. And so I'm feeling very good about how we've started so far.
Why is the project beginning in what is invariably described as the middle of nowhere?
Well, you know, I've heard people talk about our Central Valley as the middle of nowhere. I heard a member of Congress say that there were more cows than people in the Central Valley. But the problem with that analysis is that there are about 4.2 million people in California's Central Valley. And you start to look at some of these cities, you know, Fresno, 500,000 people. Modesto is bigger than Trenton. You start to compare some of these cities with their counterparts on the East Coast, where people are more familiar, and it's a huge area, and it's the fastest growing area of our state. It's also an area that has been disconnected from the rest of the state in socioeconomic terms. And I say this all the time. For a lot of people here in California, I've been here 36 years, people generally think California is divided north and south, you know, and the Dodgers versus the Giants and all of that stuff. But in fact, as I've spent the last 3.5 years traveling around the state on this project, our state is really divided in a very different way. We're divided coastal versus inland. And on the coast, we have better, cleaner environment, we have more educational institutions, a stronger economy, more opportunities. The central part of California, despite the incredible, fabulous wealth of the agricultural sector, has 3 of the 5 poorest regions in the United States. And the poverty levels there are incredible. 21% of the kids in the Central Valley have asthma, which is just a shocking statistic that no one should be satisfied to accept. And it's a part of the state that has not been connected either economically or physically with the rest of the state. If you want to take well, in fact, tonight I thought, well, hey, maybe I'll just fly from Sacramento down to San Francisco Airport, $900. You want to fly from Fresno to LA, $700, $800, $900. You're going to drive, it's 3.5 hours. We could look at high-speed rail as not only connecting those economic regions of our state, but also finding a way to allow businesses to reinvest there and revitalize and bring economic diversity to that part of the state. Plus, there are physical reasons. We get more track mile per dollar by starting there. Because it is flat. We have an opportunity to test our trains there at up to 250 miles an hour, which I would submit would be a little challenging between San Francisco and San Jose. And so, you know, there are a lot of technical reasons, but more than that, I think that there are policy reasons why making this investment in an underinvested area of California made sense.
2 points about the Central Valley. One is, you know, the proposal to split California to 6 states. If that happened, the Central Valley would be the poorest state in the Union, behind Mississippi. The other is, I recommend to you an interactive map that Mike McCoy and his friends at Davis have worked with Esri Technology in my hometown of Redlands, which shows these the health issues and the poverty issues in the Central Valley and how high-speed rail will interact with them. There is a line of criticism as well that building high-speed rail is like having a brand new landline network. That is, as when in an era of mobile phones. This is old technology. It's not Hyperloop. It's not maglev. It's not anything. We're looking to technology of the 19th or early 20th century for a 21st century economy.
Well, you know, I hear this criticism, although my cell phone service has kind of sucked lately. But setting that aside, you know, I hear this criticism all the time, and you know, it's one of these things that it's sort of hard to assess. I'm a person who is a big believer in and lover of technology. My first job out of college was at NASA. I spent 5 years at NASA working on civilian uses of space technology. In some ways, it was the best job I've ever had. And you look at technology and you try to decide, okay, is this, you know, they're all the stories, the anecdotes about people saying, well, who would ever need a home computer? And of course, now we all do. But there's another side to that too, which is, you know, I grew up in the 50s, and not only did we have nuclear power, but then it was nuclear fusion. Yeah. And fusion was going to replace everything because, you know, it was the ultimate clean cycle, if you will. And it hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened because we weren't able to crack, or so far have not been able to crack, a lot of the practical applications of it. So no one here wants to spend $68 billion to build a technology system that is obsolete. I don't believe for a minute that we're doing that. And I'm very familiar with people talking about maglev and hyperloops, and all those things I think are great and should move into the prototype stage, which is where technologies need to go. They don't go immediately from somebody's idea to application. And we've encouraged that. You know, one point I would make on this is, you look at the Japanese Shinkansen. It opened in 1964, 50 years ago. And it was called the bullet train, the bullet train. And it was the fastest train in the world. That train was 135 miles an hour. Today's fourth generation Japanese trains are about 210 miles an hour. So they're 50% faster. So it's not as though this is a static technology. This technology, whether it's the control systems or the computerized systems or the train sets themselves, is constantly being improved. The aerodynamics are better, the energy use is better, the noise levels are lower. So we're seeing a tremendous technology push just in this area of high-speed rail. It's not high-speed rail versus other technologies. So I do believe that we're building the right technology here.
I'm a journalist, so I can't ask you a philosophical question. I'll ask you a sort of historical question instead. Something that has affected my own views on this topic has been going back and looking at the history of big civilian, not military, but civilian infrastructure bets in the United States, which have almost always had their benefits under-imagined and their problems over-imagined. The Louisiana Purchase was bitterly controversial when it started. The Erie Canal was, and the Panama Canal, and the Golden Gate Bridge, even the GI Bill. The GI Bill was tremendously divisive. Robert Maynard Hutchins said it would turn campuses into hobo jungles if they had the GI Bill. And now all these things, the Medicare program was now part of the landscape. First, why do you think that is so, if it is so? But even more, how are you going to change people's imagination about this in time for them to let it get built?
I think you used the essential word here, which is imagination. You know, going back to my NASA days when they had the Apollo fire, the terrible fire in 1967 that killed the 3 astronauts, at a congressional hearing, Frank Borman, who was leading the investigation, said, well, what caused this? And his answer was, it was a failure of imagination. We never imagined the circumstances that led to this. And I think that we have a failure of imagination all the time. And I don't mean that as a pejorative. It's just the limits of what we're able to conceive and imagine. And, you know, we had an interesting experience when I was in China with Governor Brown on his trade mission. We're rocketing along through the night in the Chinese countryside at 193 miles an hour. On the Chinese high-speed rail train that goes from Beijing to Shanghai. And it was a trade mission, so we had about 85 people. A lot of them were from California's agricultural sector, from Fresno and that area, many of whom were there to sell almonds or pistachios or whatever, many of whom have very negative views about high-speed rail. All of a sudden, somebody came up to me and said, you know, the woman sitting next to me who runs one of the agricultural marketing arms just turned to me and said, gosh, if we had this in California, my husband and I could go to dinner and a show in San Francisco and come home that very night. So until she was experiencing it, she couldn't imagine how it could affect her life. And I think that as we start to put these transportation, not just high-speed rail, but the many other bold things that are going on in this state, the tremendous leadership in Los Angeles to bring back public transportation of all forms, the things that are happening in the peninsula between San Jose and San Francisco, I think people are suddenly going to realize these are important things that can change the dynamic of their lives. So we've just got to get some tracks on the ground, and we got to get some trains on the tracks. And I have a 77-year-old governor who calls me all the time saying, am I going to get to ride this thing? So we're doing our best.
So just one last question for you before I turn it over to the audience. There are a lot of other things you could be doing with your time and your life right now. Why are you doing this? Why are you fighting this fight?
You know, we all have the things that kind of light our candles on this, but maybe I'm just a frustrated engineer, you know, and I'm not an engineer, but I just think that there's tremendous satisfaction in building things and in leaving something. And not to try to wax too poetic on this, but you know, we are living off of the investments that not just our parents made, but in some cases our grandparents made. You know, in this state, we had Pat Brown, who was one of the truly great political leaders, Jerry Brown's father. And by the way, you want to talk about things that are controversial, Pat Brown proposed the master plan for the California higher education system, passed by 1 vote. Pat Brown proposed the California Water Project that has knitted the state together that allows water to move from northern to southern California, passed the legislature by 1 vote. We passed the legislature by 1 vote. The Warren-Alquist Act, our really forward-thinking energy law that set up all the appliance and building efficiency standards, 1 vote. So these things are always difficult. But I look around and, you know, when I was serving on BART, I would say to people, we're just so fortunate that people in the prior generation made these investments. And then you look at yourself and say, and what are we doing? And we seem paralyzed by the 24-hour news cycle. And if you step back from all that, you start to ask yourself, what is our responsibility as citizens? And you know, listening to Carlos talk about the 47 million more Americans, the 11 or 12 million more here in California, I think it's a moral failure to not be making the investments. And I will tell you, you know, having worked for Jerry Brown going back to 1978, you know, I've heard him say many times, we will not eat our seed corn. If we're down to our last dime, we'll find a penny to invest in the future. I think we need more political leaders like that. Because when I listen to our partners from the Department of Transportation, I think they've laid out an extremely bold plan for where this nation should go. It's a question of political will, and not just from our leaders, but from ourselves. You know, we can't, and I'll tell you, we came back from China, and the governor looked around at what the Chinese are doing, and of course there's good and bad stuff, but he just said, America's got to get off its backside. I mean, so this is a privilege for me to work on a project like this that could have a very transformative effect. And very quickly, it's not just about the train. And I think that's been the big change that Governor Brown's leadership team, his Secretary of Transportation, Brian Kelly, myself, Jeff Morales, have all come from widespread transportation backgrounds. And we're seeing this as the spinal part of a system for a broad-based rail modernization in California. And that's what our legislature basically appropriated money for. It wasn't just high-speed rail. It was $13 billion for high-speed rail, for commuter rail, for intercity, Amtrak improvements. So that's what we're doing here in California. And I think we're making the investments now to provide for that next generation. And I just think it's our moral responsibility to do that.
Who has a question? If you, yes, raise your hand and a microphone will come to you, and here it comes. And identify yourself, please.
Hi, Phil Polikoff, I'm a physician. Could you just extrapolate your vision, which is magnificent, to why this energy isn't being shown in the health delivery system in the state? So why can't you take what you've done? Yeah. Every word you said was magnificent. You mentioned the 21% on the asthmatics. You didn't mention the diabetic cases there and the obesity. How do you take your passion, give it to the governor a little stronger in the health? Because what you're trying to do is the solution in part to the health delivery system when you restructure the economics of the inner part of California.
Prisons in the Middle East, you can work in there too.
I'm just imagining my phone call to the governor tomorrow saying, you know, I've been thinking about the healthcare system. I will say this: all these things are controversial, but at least from my perspective, and I've had the privilege and the challenge of knowing Jerry Brown and working for him for 4 decades. You know, if you look around at what we're doing in California, and you know, one way to look at it is this governor is investing in transportation infrastructure, water infrastructure, in the education system. I mean, if you think about what do we have to do for the future, I think it's physical infrastructure education of our people, human capital development, and protection of them through the healthcare system. I'm just not expert enough on healthcare issues to know. But, you know, we had, I mean, my friend Diana Dooley, the Secretary of Health, I mean, we had a very successful launch of our exchange, covered California, and that's about all I know about it. But I think that this administration is very forward-looking in terms of making these investments now for the future.
Who has are there any doubts remaining in the room about the high-speed rail? I will take silence as evidence there. Yes, go ahead.
He has doubts. There are 38 million Californians and one person
James,
has a doubt.
we read your lists all the time. I'm Gary Fleeman from Mountain View, and one of the doubts that is expressed in my local neighborhood is the other end of the train on the south side. We have a very dense Caltrain corridor, as your team certainly knows. So one of the things that I hear a lot in our Google, LinkedIn environment is the local technology feeds that we have in the Bay Area don't exactly translate to a way to empty the artery at the other end. I think that's the last mile, and in some cases in LA, it may be the last 6 hours, to get down there. So if you could speak to something on that. And I have a personal request to sneak in while I have the microphone. Please don't let anyone that worked on that Caltrain to SFO connection have anything to do with high-speed rail. But how does that last mile or 6 miles in LA come to play on the high-speed rail?
Well, this is the part that I think we've been most excited about, and frankly, I think Jeff Morales and I and our whole leadership team is most proud of, is that when we came in, what we saw was a program that essentially was a standalone insular program. Don't touch me, I got my money source, leave me alone, and there was virtually no communication with local and regional transportation agencies. That has all completely changed. We are working now in close partnership, not just with Caltrain, but we negotiated with BART so that BART gave up some money that they had to help with the Caltrain electrification in return for our support for BART railcar modernization. We're working closely with LA Metro to be the last piece of the funding puzzle for the run-through tracks that would connect Amtrak north of Union Station with Amtrak south of Union Station. We were the last piece of the funding puzzle for the Central Subway in San Francisco that will connect down to 4th and King. So my point here is that we have viewed high-speed rail as a tool to complete the funding package for a lot of these other systems so that we can have that arterial and venous kind of transportation system that you're talking about. And the funny thing happens when you start working together with other people. When we look at our ridership projections, they depend on BART and Caltrain delivering customers to us. Our delivering customers to them will make those assets operate more efficiently. So we are very much about looking at our entire transportation system, and not just rail. In the city of Fresno, Mayor Ashley Swearingen, who is one of the state's leading lights, in my opinion, has proposed a bus rapid transit system that would go through the city of Fresno and terminate at the new Fresno high-speed rail station. So this is where we're really looking at intermodalism. We're really looking at cooperation between transportation agencies. And I think we're making tremendous progress because we're doing it together.
As a final question, taking the Brown, oh, sorry, yes, go ahead. You can have the final question.
Bill Bergwijn, I'm a citizen here in Sacramento. One of the things, so much of this is about building it and not a lot about operating it. How are you going to make it affordable for average people to ride the train? And that it's, you talk about your, going into one of the most poverty-stricken sections of the country.
Right.
How do you make people, that train is something that's available to them? That they can afford it, that they can take their service dog on the train and such things. And breaking out of the old train thing of you stop at every damn station practically between here and Los Angeles. Will there be non-stop trains to LA?
Absolutely.
Will there be local trains? Will there be all this, bring as much service as possible with this system?
Thank you.
So it's a very important question, and one of the predicates for our program is that we as a governmental entity will build the basic first pieces of the infrastructure. But our business model is that actually then, following what they've done in Japan and France and other places, we will auction the rights to the private sector to come in and operate on that infrastructure. Much as the US government built the air traffic control system, and the airlines come in and they operate on that infrastructure. And what we expect is that there will be a whole range of services as they look at how to serve those markets. But we will want to make certain that equities are respected. I was on the train in China, and Jim can correct me on this, but I was on the train in China, and a reporter came up to me and he said, well, this is fine, we're all up here in business class, but if we just build a business class train in California, what about the other 99%? And I said, why don't you walk back about 3 cars? And you walk back about 3 cars, and there's 3x3 seating, and there's workers traveling between Beijing and Shanghai, and that's an affordable means of transportation. My understanding is Japan, it's the same thing. We priced our pricing model is based on competing against a discounted airline ticket. So if we had this system in place today, we believe that you could go from LA to San Francisco on high-speed rail for about $85. And so I think that's affordable for most people. It's cheaper. We're trying to be underneath what Southwest would charge you in that, in that system. So it's very important to make sure that this system reaches out through our entire population. And we're quite focused on that, but that's our expectation. And that's been true of high-speed rail lines around the world.
Will Governor Brown be on ride one of these trains?
You betcha.
Well, that's an answer I didn't anticipate, but well put. So please join me in thanking Dan Richard for his performance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.